Last Sunday morning, I preached on the Apostle Philip, and that was preparation for a lesson that I'll be preaching somewhere else later this year. But I had such good response, such good favorable comments about that lesson, and having already had all my materials out dealing with the apostles, I since decided to do a series of lessons on the apostles. Today we want to look at two of them, two brothers, James and John, the sons of thunder. They were the second pair of brothers that Jesus called to follow him. We first read about them in Mark chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. And when he had gone a little further thence, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, who also were in the ship mending their nets. And straightway he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the ship with the hired servants, and went after him. Just up the lake shore from where Simon and Andrew had been called, who were their partners in the fishing trade, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were working in their ship. They were preparing their nets for their next fishing trip. Jesus called them, and they left their father, and they left the hired help in the boat. And the presence of hired servants shows me that they were all conducting a capable and productive fishing business. It may be that these carried on the fishing business for their father, but James and John left immediately after Jesus called them. James, the son of Zebedee, is sometimes called James the Greater, in contrast to James, the son of Alphaeus, who is sometimes called James the Less. Turn over to Mark 3, 14 and 15. And here we see that Jesus desired to form a compact, organized body of disciples who would later be commissioned to teach his doctrine. In Mark 3:14, he ordained 12, that they should be with him, and that he might send them forth to preach and to have power to heal sicknesses and to cast out devils or demons. These 12 men would be able to continue his work when he returned to the Father. They would be his most trusted friends on earth. They would be the ones into whom he would pour out his life and his vision. Each one of them would become an apostle, a messenger sent on a mission. And among them were the brothers, James and John. Notice first of all that James and John were the sons of Zebedee and Salome. Now I want to talk about that for a minute because it might interest you to know that in my opinion, James and John were cousins of the Lord Jesus. And that Salome was the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now I want to show you why I think that. We know that Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the Apostle John were at the foot of the cross when Jesus was suffering. There are 3 lists of the other women who were at the cross. Let's look at them, shall we? Look in Matthew 27 and verse 56. Here's the first one. Matthew 27, 56. Among which were Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Joseph and the mother of Zebedee's children. So here we have Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less and Joseph, and we also have the mother of Zebedee's children. Now who was the mother of Zebedee's children? That is Salome. For further confirmation, let's go to Mark. Look at Mark 15 and verse 40. And here is Mark's list. Mark 15:40, there were also women looking on afar off, among whom were Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James the Less and of Joseph, and Salome. The other passage said, the mother of Zebedee's children. This passage identifies her by name. The mother of Zebedee's children was Salome. All right, now let's turn to the third list. Look at John 19:25. John 19:25. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, that's Mary, and his mother's sister. Then Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. Now notice closely. There were three Marys at the foot of the cross. There was Mary, the mother of Jesus. There was Mary, the wife of Cleopas, who was also the mother of James the Less and Joseph. And there was Mary Magdalene. Three Marys. And alongside these three Marys, there was the Apostle John and one other woman. Who is this woman? Well, in Matthew, this woman is identified as the mother of Zebedee's children. That's James and John, who we're studying about this morning. She is the wife of Zebedee. She is the mother of James and John. And the Apostle John identifies this woman, or Mark identifies her as Salome. And then you turn to the book of John, and what do we find? You've got three Marys. And then he identifies this other woman as Jesus' mother's sister. When you put all that information together, you become aware for the very first time that Salome, wife of Zebedee, mother of James and John, was Mary's sister. That makes James and John the cousins of Jesus. That might help to explain why Salome asked for special favors for them in the Lord's kingdom in Matthew 20:20. We'll see that later. The home of James and John was probably Capernaum. They were fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. They were in partnership with Peter and Andrew, Luke 5 and verse 10. And from the reference to the hired servants of Zebedee in Mark 1:20, and the mention of the fact that Salome was one of the women who ministered of their substance to Jesus and their company in Mark 15:41, I think it can be inferred that this family was quite wealthy. Now, James and John would be prominent among the 12 apostles. Second of all, James and John were the sons of thunder. What do we mean by that? Look now at Mark 3:16 and 17. In Mark 3:16, and Simon he surnamed Peter, and James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, and he surnamed them Boanerges, which is the sons of thunder. So Jesus gave surnames or nicknames to Peter, James, and John. These surnames were nicknames or descriptive labels that the Lord attached to his closest disciples. And he called James and John Boanerges, which translated means sons of thunder. Evidently they were fiery in temperament, hasty in judgment, quick to punish the offender. If you have trouble controlling your temper, then you can relate to these men. The first time the temper of the two brothers comes to forefront is over in Luke 9. Turn over to Luke 9. I appreciate you following along with me in your Bibles. Luke chapter 9, 51 through 54. Luke 9:51, it came to pass when the time was come that he should be received up. He steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem and sent messengers before his face, and they went and entered into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. And they did not receive him, because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. And when his disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias did? So here the descriptive character of their nickname takes on added meaning. The Samaritans resented their country being used as a highway for people to attend the Jewish feast. They weren't about to accommodate any Jews going down there. The fact that Jesus went directly through Samaria on his way to Jerusalem actually says something about Jesus, because he was free of the ugly attitudes of discrimination and prejudice felt by the people of his day. We need to emulate him, of course, in that regard. But the reception that Jesus received made James and John mad. And here's an illustration of both thunder and lightning in their angry protests and in their proposal that Jesus destroy this village. And the fact that they proposed that the entire village be wiped out might be suggestive of the fact that they had canvassed not just maybe the village inn, but everybody in there in the houses, seeking somebody with some hospitality, some generous soul who might be willing to take them in for the night. And they were quite perturbed over the situation, and given the miraculous power and the divine consent to do so, James and John were ready to be direct instruments of God's divine wrath. Now, before we condemn them too harshly, maybe we need to remember times that maybe we've also displayed some unchristian attitudes when under stress and strain. We're never more vulnerable to temptation than when we're angry. You know, they had just seen Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration. And their minds probably went back to Elijah. And they sought to do something that Elijah had done. The reference here is 2 Kings 1, 10 through 16, where Elijah was saved from death by calling down fire from heaven to destroy 2 detachments of a captain and 50 soldiers that had been sent by King Ahaziah to execute him. Well, on that occasion, the prophet had acted under direct instructions from God to save Elijah's life, and furthermore, he was commissioned to confront that evil king. He was acting more like modern civil authority. Circumstances are a whole lot different here. Luke 9:55, but he turned and rebuked them and said, Ye know not what manner of spirit ye are of. For the Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they went to another village. They would have punished without mercy this village of the Samaritans, but the Lord rebuked the very thought of them doing such a thing. Violence seldom serves to abolish prejudice. God says in Romans 12:19, Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. So we have to refrain from returning in kind, rendering evil for evil, or railing for railing, knowing that all those matters will be settled come judgment day. Judgment will finally come upon the wicked, and God will triumph. So we ought not to get sidetracked by others' responses of rejection to the gospel message, but press on with our mission. And that's what Jesus told them to do here. Next, James and John were part of the inner three. Peter, James, and John. They appear to have been the closest to Jesus. Brother Rex A. Turner Sr., who I never had the privilege of sitting at the feet of, but I know that Bob did. He said the companions of Jesus were the three apostles who composed the inner circle, and who were to furnish the main leadership in the early days of the church. J.W. McGarvey said, these three were honored above their fellows by special privileges on several occasions because their natures better fitted them to understand the work of Christ. The inner circle would be eyewitnesses of three special events in the life of Christ: the raising of Jairus' daughter from the dead, the transfiguration, and his prayer at the Garden of Gethsemane. And after studying those series of events, it occurs to me there's a connection between these events that ought to be evident to each of us. Each of those three events has the single thread of death woven in them. And they're all closely connected to the mission of Christ. Look at Hebrews 2:14 through 15, where the Hebrew writer identifies that mission as follows. In Hebrews 2:14, for as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. That passage shows us that Christ accepted human flesh. He accosted the devil, and he accomplished the deliverance of man from the fear of death. And it was important that the apostles understand these facts regarding the mission of Christ to earth, and to help prepare them for an understanding of these things. The Lord would reveal to the inner three important lessons about death. They would see his supernatural power over death in the raising of Jairus' daughter. They would see a shining panorama clarifying death on the Mount of Transfiguration. And third, they would see a submissive prayer about death in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the lessons learned from those private experiences would aid them greatly, following the Lord's death and burial and resurrection and ascension. Take a look at Philippians 3:10. That verse sort of sums that up. Philippians 3:10, Paul says, that I may know him as revealed by his glory at the transfiguration, and the power of his resurrection as reflected by his raising of Jairus' daughter, and the fellowship of his sufferings as represented by his experience in Gethsemane, being made conformable unto his death. If you and I would be resurrected unto eternal life and glorified with Christ, then we have to be willing to submit our will to our Heavenly Father's, despite the suffering, the shame, and the sacrifice involved. And this, James and John were willing to do. Now let's look at Mark chapter 10, 35 through 37. Fourthly, James and John approached Jesus with some ambitious plans. Mark 10:35, and James and John, the sons of Zebedee, come unto him, saying, Master, we would thou shouldst do for us whatsoever we should desire. He said unto them, What would ye that I should do for you? They said unto him, Grant unto us that we may sit one on thy right hand and the other on thy left hand in thy glory. It's interesting that Matthew adds their mother was with them. Salome was with them. Matthew 20, 20, and 21. They probably were hoping to use their family relationship to gain some personal advantage. They had in their minds the picture of Christ on an earthly throne, And they had him surrounded by servants with the two of them as his right-hand men. And they wanted to be the chief administrators in the coming kingdom. It's just like if one wanted to be the Secretary of State and the other wanted to be the Secretary of the Treasury. The sons of Zebedee were positioning themselves for power. They were very competitive. They wanted greatness. And their request represented an effort on their part to be elevated above the other apostles. Look down at Mark 10:41, where it says, "And when the 10 heard it, they began to be much displeased with James and John." I can just imagine. Because this was a selfish maneuver, and it showed a fundamental misconception of what God's kingdom was going to be. Now, Mark 10:38. "But Jesus said unto them, You know not what ye ask. Can ye drink of the cup that I drink of, and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? And they said unto him, We can. We're able. And Jesus said unto them, Ye shall indeed drink of the cup that I drink of, and with the baptism that I am baptized withal shall ye be baptized. But to sit on my right hand and on my left hand is not mine to give. But it shall be given to them for whom it is prepared." Positions both in the church and in heaven are not donations given out to friends and relatives like in politics. But it's gained through faithful service and loyalty to Christ and godly living. And it's not a matter of knowing the right person or pulling the right strings. Verse 43. "But so shall it not be among you, but whosoever will be great among you shall be your minister." Jesus is teaching there that the path to greatness in the kingdom begins in service. Not whom you know or to whom you're related. And do we possess a self-seeking attitude of, I want you to do for me whatever I ask of you? Like James and John on this occasion, are we affected by that kind of ambition? Can we demonstrate a servant's heart toward those with whom we have been selfish? Philippians 2:3, "Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves." One translation says, "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition." If you want to be exalted, make it your ambition to humbly love and serve God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Mark 12 and verse 30. We can admire the courage and loyalty of James and John on this occasion. Although their reply seems to be too self-confident, the Lord's statement to them was prophetic. Both James and John would suffer for his sake. Turn over to Acts 12, 1 and 2. James the Greater had the distinction of being the first apostolic martyr in Christian history. We read about it in Acts 12, 1 and 2. "Now about that time Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James the brother of John with the sword." That's about 44 AD. He's killed during a Jewish persecution led by Herod Antipas, which was also the occasion for Peter's imprisonment right after James was executed. He was the first of the apostolic martyrs in church history. He is the only apostle whose martyrdom is recorded in the pages of the New Testament. And his death shows he stood the test. His martyrdom shows God didn't always miraculously intervene to deliver his apostles. And we should also note that the New Testament records no appointment of a successor to James. Why? Because he's still an apostle. He's still reigning over the 12 tribes of spiritual Israel, just as Jesus promised in Matthew 19:28. Death never removed an apostle. It was not death but transgression that removed Judas, Acts 1:25. I think about how it's unfortunate we don't have any writings from the Apostle James. The book of James is actually believed to have been written by James, the Lord's brother, not this James. And while James was the first apostle to die, his brother John was the last. You recall that Jesus chose John to care for his mother at the foot of the cross in John 19:26 and 27. And at some point, John was exiled to the Isle of Patmos as a prisoner of Rome, Revelation 1:9, by the Emperor Domitian. And it was during this time that he received that heavenly vision that he recorded as Jesus instructed him, which comes now down to us as the book of Revelation. And in that book, we've got the marvelous vision of Christ's triumph over all of his enemies, as well as his great gospel account and the books of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. In my opinion, John is one of the greatest examples in Holy Writ of how the Lord can change and mold men. In old age, John was a mellow man. His writings were done mostly in his latter years, and the word love appears more than 50 times in his 3 epistles. Tradition claims that he was carried to meetings where he, while leaning on a cane with quivering voice, would say, "Little children, love one another." And while all the other apostles, apart from Judas, suffered and died for their faith, it was said of John that he suffered and lived for his faith. He died in Ephesus around the year 100 AD. And how thankful we should be for these 2 brothers and apostles of the Lord. And the work of the Lord's kingdom will always be carried forward by those that are ready to say, "We can. We are able." If you're here today and not a servant of Christ the King, as James and John were, you can become a child of God by faith that turns from sin, confesses Christ, and is baptized into Christ, Galatians 3:26 and 27. If you're here as a child of God, need to come repenting of public sin, confessing it, we'll pray with you and for you. Come as together we stand and sing.